Now, as mentioned in the previous week's video, Australian government has announced their cap on international student numbers. Before even the legislation is approved, Australian government has already announced their cap on international numbers that will be commencing from the 1st of January 2025. And in this video, we'll give you an overview of what this change is and how it impacts higher education, vocational education students who are exempt from these caps, and also will give you some comparison to previous year data as well. So if you want to know all this information, make sure to stick around till the end. So let's start off this video with an overview of this new system. So during this week, Minister for Education, Jason Clare, announced the cap numbers for international students. Now they call it as a national planning level. Basically, national planning levels are the number of international students new commencements in Australia in one calendar year. So for the calendar year 2025, which is from the 1st of January 2025 to 31st of December 2025, the total number of new commencements of international students will be capped at 270,000 places. Now this number of 270,000 spots will be split between higher education providers and vocational education providers. Of course, there are some exemptions to these national planning levels, and we will talk about those groups a bit later on. But for now, it's important to note that this number will be split between higher education and vocational education providers. Now, you might be wondering how this new commencement will be counted. It has been explained in the Department of Education's website. They say an international student will count as a new overseas student commencement when they are on shore and start their first non-exempt course at their first provider. And each time the student changes into non-exempt course at a different provider. So basically, any student who is starting their new course in Australia or they are changing the course at a new provider, they will be counted as a new commencement. So this 270,000 number will apply to people who are coming for the studies for the first time, and also for those who will be changing their course within Australia from one provider to another. The government says this number will be reviewed annually. The idea behind this student cap is to bring back the numbers to pre-pandemic levels, which, as I said, we will look at that a bit later on in this video. Now just keep in mind that this is subject to the approval of legislation, which means it has not come into effect yet or it has not been passed. But if the legislation gets passed, then this cap will come into effect from the 1st of January 2025. Now let's look at these cap numbers based on higher education program providers and vocational education providers. So first, let's look at the higher education providers. So for the public funded universities, government has capped the new enrollments at 145,000, which means public universities in Australia will be able to issue only 145,000 enrollments for the next year. They also provide another 30,000 places, but these are for private universities and other higher education providers. And for public university, Australian government has also set an individual student limits as well, which means that each public university will have only a certain amount of students that they can enroll into their courses. This they call it now international student profiles. So each university basically will have their own individual limits as well, especially the public universities. The minister also encouraged universities to build more student housing by 2026, especially if they wish to grow these numbers beyond the limits they have been given. Now, in terms of vocational education providers, they have been capped at 95,000 spots for the year 2025. The minister also mentioned that there will be lower allocations for providers with a higher proportion of international students. Especially in vocational education and training, those providers who have a high reliance on international students, they will get lower spots during the year. Now, as per minister, this is done to encourage that diversity so that the vocational education providers start enrolling more domestic or local students. So that was a split of 145,000 spots for public universities, 30,000 spots for other private universities and higher education providers, and 95,000 spots for vocational education providers. Now, there are obviously other group of international students who study in Australia. So here we're going to discuss of some of those groups that are exempt from this cap. So here are the groups that are exempt from this cap. That includes schools, students who are studying alicourse courses only, higher degree by research students, any non-award students, any Australian government sponsored or foreign government sponsored scholarship students, other Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade sponsored students, students that are part of Australian Transitional Education Agreements and Twinning Arrangements, and students who are from Pacific and Timor-Leste. So these are some groups that are exempt from these caps. They won't be included in the cap the minister has mentioned in the release. Now let's look at some comparison of these numbers to previous years. We got this data from the Department of Education in Australia. So if you look at this data here, especially from the last 5 years, from 2019 to 2023, and we are going to look at higher education and vocational education first. In 2019, higher education providers has 177,181 new commencements, which seems close to the total of 175,000 spots in this new cap. Just keep in mind that these higher education numbers do include higher degree by research students that is specifically exempt from this cap. And in terms of vocational education, in 2019, 168,414 new commencements were there. Comparatively, in 2019, the higher education seems quite close to what they have got allocation for in the year 2025. And this is what government is aiming for, as they want to go close to the pre-pandemic levels for international students in Australia. But comparatively to vocational education, there is a huge decrease in that. Nearly 73,000 less spots have been allocated for vocational education providers. Now, if we jump all the way up to the latest data we have, which is year 2023, the story is quite different. For higher education providers, there were around 207,000 new commencements, and for vocational education providers, there were more than 190,000 commencements. Now you can see yourself that comparing to the 2023 data, there are obviously significantly less numbers for vocational education and training, and also for higher education as well. Again, keep in mind in the higher education data that there are some research students that are included in it. We just couldn't get a data that did not include higher education student by research. So it gives you a clear idea that there has been a huge reduction in numbers for vocational education and training, and universities and other higher education provider also seem to have a huge cut in their new enrollments for the year 2025 onwards. Obviously, higher education providers and vocational education providers are quite upset about it. However, some universities are supporting this as well, especially the regional universities, as they have been allocated decent numbers of international students for the next year. But there are many universities who have a higher proportion of international students in their campuses will suffer a lot, as they will get reduction in these student numbers based on these caps. However, if you look at the same data, there is no change for school students, for students who are doing ALI course, and also for non-award students as well. Now, another thing that was mentioned by the minister was replacement of this Ministerial Direction 107. In this current system of Ministerial Direction 107, the education providers are usually categorized into 3 different risk categories, which are high, medium and low. And over the last year or so, the preferences were given to the low risk providers. Now, if this new cap things come into place, the minister mentioned that this will replace that old ranking system of high, medium or low, as they will be able to manage the number of students with the caps that they're planning to put in place. As expected, there is a huge backlash from universities, especially those who are losing huge number of allocations of international students. And obviously, vocational education providers are no different as well. And all of them are hoping that this law does not get passed in the parliament. It might go through with some amendments, but looking at the current scenario, it seems like it might just get passed in the parliament, as both the major parties have shown a support of putting cap on international student numbers. And as I mentioned in the previous video as well, it has become quite a hot debate, especially for the upcoming elections in Australia. Obviously, as a student, you will see some impact on yourself, as universities will become more selective in choosing the students based on factors like who's likely going to get a visa and other factors. And you can also expect universities to put up their tuition fee for international students as well, as they would like to cover these losses by increasing their fees. Also, there might be a chance that there might be less number of scholarships available for international students as well, because of the limited number of spots available. Especially for those students who want to study at certain universities, there will be higher competition with these limited spots as well. So if you are planning to study in Australia in 2025, you might have to consider your options, whether it is worthwhile for you to study in Australia, or if you are planning to study, then which city or which university might be better. And I would love to hear your thoughts regarding this cap on international student numbers in the comment section below. We did a bit of analysis on our previous week's video regarding these caps as well. So if you would like to watch, I suggest you to check this video here where I discuss about these caps and their impacts on students, universities and Australian economy as well. So click the video there and I'll see you there.